Welcome. The Origins and Healing of Attention Deficit Disorder by Gabor Maté. This text fundamentally shifts the perspective on ADD from a strictly genetic, illness-based model to one that understands it as a developmental delay rooted in early childhood environments, family dynamics, and the innate sensitivity of the child. Through a compassionate and deeply personal lens, Dr. Maté, who himself has ADD, explores how the neurological circuits of attention and emotional self-regulation are shaped in infancy. More importantly, this work offers profound hope. Because ADD is a developmental impairment rather than a fixed pathology, the brain's plasticity allows for healing, emotional growth, and the realization of one's full potential at any stage of life. Chapter 1. The True Nature and Experience of ADD. Attention deficit disorder is perpetually trapped in a polarized public debate. On one side stand those who view it as an inescapable genetic curse, a biological destiny written in the DNA. On the other side are those who dismiss it entirely as a myth, the predictable product of lazy parenting and a lack of moral discipline. Both perspectives are fundamentally incomplete. The human brain is not a static organ programmed solely by biological heredity. Its intricate circuits are actively sculpted by the environment into which a child is born. The psychological states of the parents, the unspoken tensions within the home, and the frantic pace of the surrounding culture all play a profound role in shaping the neurophysiology of the developing mind. This condition is not a matter of either genes or environment, but a complex, inextricably linked dance between the two. Crucially, acknowledging the role of the early environment is not an invitation to cast blame. It is a simplistic and destructive human impulse to assume that if something goes wrong, someone must be at fault. Parents of children with attention deficit disorder already navigate a daily gauntlet of incomprehension, enduring the harsh, whispered judgments of teachers, relatives, and strangers on the street. They do not need another finger pointed at them. The reality of raising a child who struggles with this condition or living with it oneself is akin to standing in the center of a crowded, echoing room where everyone is shouting simultaneously and suddenly being demanded to comprehend a single specific whisper. It is a state of perpetual neurological overwhelm. What is required is not guilt, but a compassionate, clear-eyed awareness of how early emotional relationships and surroundings shape our cognitive destinies. For decades, I lived immersed in this overwhelming reality without ever truly understanding it. My discovery of my own attention deficit disorder arrived in my 50s, an epiphany that brought both profound exhilaration and a sharp, grieving pain. Suddenly, a lifetime of chaotic inner experience made sense. The mind of the adult with this condition is never at rest. It flits about like a panicked bird, desperate for a place to land but incapable of perching anywhere long enough to call it home. There is a deep, intrinsic terror of one's own consciousness. For most of my life, I could not endure a single moment alone with my unmedicated thoughts. I constantly fed my brain scraps of distraction, a book, a frantic worry, an impossible schedule, treating my mind like a ferocious beast that would devour me if it were not constantly chewing on something else. This shock of self-recognition provides coherence to a history littered with unfulfilled plans, broken promises, and bursts of manic enthusiasm that inevitably burn themselves out, leaving only emotional wreckage behind. It explains the chronic physical clumsiness, the inexplicable eruptions of temper, and the profound, haunting sense of possessing talents and insights that remain forever blocked behind crossed neurological wires. One patient captured this fragmented existence with poetic dissonance, describing his mind as so much soup and garbage can. It is an image of profound distress and confusion, reflecting a soul that found reality so unbearable that the mind had to shatter itself simply to fragment the pain. Life becomes an exhausting performance, much like a frantic juggler spinning plates on precarious sticks. The scattered personality keeps adding more obligations, running back and forth in a desperate attempt to keep everything balanced. Unlike the stage performer, however, we cannot simply stop the show. We wait in terror for the inevitable crash. The condition is officially defined by a triad of impairments: poor attention, deficient impulse control, and hyperactivity. Yet, the absolute hallmark is an involuntary, automatic tuning out. This is not a conscious choice to ignore the world, but a frustrating, physiological absence of mind. One feels cut off from the physical present, as though the head were floating in a different dimension, entirely disconnected from the body. This tuning out destroys the capacity for order. There is simply no mental template for organization. A seemingly simple task, like cleaning a room, devolves into a labyrinth of distractions. You pick up a book, read a paragraph, remember a mythological reference, pull down an encyclopedia, and an hour later the room is in greater disarray than before. The physical environment mirrors the mind, fleeting illusions of order inevitably surrendering to absolute unyielding chaos. Observers often point out that a person with this condition can concentrate fiercely on things they enjoy, arguing that the attention deficit is therefore a matter of willful disobedience. This fundamentally misunderstands the brain. Such hyperfocusing is usually a state of passive attention, requiring no effortful energy from the intellect, much like staring entranced into a television screen. Active attention, the capacity to marshal mental resources toward an uninteresting or demanding task, requires a functioning motivational apparatus that the scattered mind simply lacks without the adrenaline rush of an immediate crisis. The condition is deeply situational. The brain's ability to engage fluctuates wildly depending on the emotional context and the level of intrinsic interest. Alongside this absent-mindedness runs an agonizing current of impulsivity and hyperactivity. It is an abhorrence of boredom, a ceaseless white noise static humming in the background of consciousness. This organic drivenness compels the individual to be perpetually in motion, convinced they should be doing something, even if they have no idea what that something is. Yet, paradoxically, this frantic internal pacing coexists with crippling procrastination. Without the terrifying immediate threat of an impending deadline, the motivational circuits remain completely dormant. We wait until the precipice of failure to begin, relying on panic to provide the neurochemical fuel that our brains cannot naturally generate. The consequences stretch far beyond unfinished chores. They blight human relationships. There is a pervasive inability to read the subtle, non-verbal cues of social interaction. The adult often feels like an alien from a different planet, peering through a window at a club to which everyone else intuitively belongs. The conversational pacing is off. Words tumble out in a desperate, pressured rush, driven by the fear that a thought will evaporate before it can be spoken. Moods oscillate violently between exuberant anticipation and sulking despair. Underlying it all is the tragic landscape of permanent potential, a lifetime marked by the ghosts of many roads not traveled. Given how common these traits are, skepticism naturally arises. Is this truly a disorder, or are we simply pathologizing the normal struggles of human existence? It is crucial to understand that attention deficit disorder is not a categorical disease like pneumonia, which you either have or do not have. It exists on a continuum. We all possess these traits to some degree. It is only when the concentration of these characteristics reaches a threshold that profoundly impairs a person's ability to function and find peace that we apply the diagnosis. Calling it a medical disorder is, in many ways, a misnomer that traps us in an illness model. It is more accurate to view it as a developmental impairment. It is the physiological consequence of a sensitive genetic predisposition colliding with a specific emotional and cultural environment. The most critical environment for the developing brain is the emotional climate of the early childhood home. In my own family, there was never a lack of profound love, but love felt by a parent does not automatically translate into a sense of security experienced by the child. Our marriage, like many, was steeped in the unspoken anxieties and suppressed conflicts of two well-meaning adults struggling with their own unresolved histories. I sought refuge in an exhausting kamikaze work schedule, using my professional indispensability to escape the terrifying intimacy of the present moment. I was physically present but emotionally tuned out. A young child cannot comprehend the complexities of an adult's neuroses. When a parent is consistently distracted, stressed, or emotionally inaccessible, the infant experiences this as a devastating abandonment. The child unconsciously internalizes the belief that they are unworthy of attention, prompting their highly sensitive nervous system to exist in a state of chronic hair-trigger alarm. This early atmosphere directly shapes the architecture of the brain, particularly the prefrontal cortex, which governs emotional self-regulation, impulse control, and the perception of time. To the scattered mind, time is not a continuous, manageable flow. We suffer from a profound time blindness, existing only in the immediate now or the infinite not now. We operate under the magical thinking of a toddler, genuinely believing that intentions will miraculously manifest without the tedious passage of chronological effort. We forget to remember the future. decisions are made entirely on the impulse of the present moment, utterly disconnected from long-term consequences. This failure of self-regulation reveals that the adult remains mired in the unsolved developmental tasks of early childhood. When faced with stress, the higher cognitive functions shut down and the primitive emotional centers of the brain take over, resulting in the sudden rages or paralyzing lethargy characteristic of an infant. Imagine a bustling, complex intersection where traffic flows heavily in all directions. The prefrontal cortex is the traffic policeman, prioritizing signals, inhibiting some impulses so that others may proceed safely. In the mind afflicted with attention deficit, this policeman has fallen asleep on the job. The brain is flooded with a deafening cacophony of sensory data, memories, and urges, creating a gridlock of thought and action. Stimulant medications do not artificially calm a hyperactive mind. Rather, they serve to wake up the sleeping policeman, arousing the dormant inhibitory centers so that order might temporarily be restored. On the harsh western shores of Vancouver Island, one finds scruffy, stunted conifers, twisted by the elements. It would be absurd to diagnose these hardy survivors with a disease. They have simply developed to the maximum extent that their severe environment allowed. Human development is no different. The scattered mind is not a diseased mind. It is an adaptation, a survival response to an emotional climate that could not support the majestic, straight growth of unhindered potential. Recognizing that this condition is a problem of halted development rather than an incurable pathology opens the door to profound hope. Nature's agenda for human maturation was interrupted, but it was not destroyed. The brain's plasticity means that its circuits are not permanently frozen in their childhood configurations. The path to healing is not about curing a disease, but about creating the compassionate conditions necessary for the scattered mind to finally resume its growth and become whole. Chapter 2. The Developing Brain: Heredity, Sensitivity, and Environment. To understand the origins of a scattered mind, one must first discard the rigid, outdated debate that pits nature against nurture. We are accustomed to thinking of our biology as a fixed destiny, a predetermined script written entirely by the genetic code we inherit at conception. However, the human brain is a magnificent exception to this rule. Unlike the brains of other mammals, which are largely pre-wired for survival at birth, the human infant arrives into the world with an underdeveloped neurological architecture. This profound vulnerability is evolutionary genius. It allows the human mind to be custom-tailored to the specific environment it must navigate. Our genetic blueprint provides the raw materials and the potential, but it is the environment, specifically the emotional environment of early childhood, that acts as the architect, deciding which neural pathways will be built, which will be reinforced, and which will be allowed to wither away. What is inherited in attention deficit disorder is not a specific gene for distractibility or impulsivity. Science has yet to find, and likely never will find, a single ADD gene. Instead, what is passed down through the generations is a trait far more foundational, an exquisite, profound sensitivity. Some infants arrive into the world with nervous systems that are highly porous to sensory and emotional input. If we imagine the average human nervous system as a sturdy wooden barrier, the sensitive child's nervous system is a delicate, vibrating membrane. They feel things more deeply, react more intensely, and absorb the emotional currents of their surroundings with a terrifying efficiency. This sensitivity is a beautiful gift. It is the wellspring of deep empathy, artistic intuition, and extraordinary creativity. Yet, it is also a source of immense vulnerability. This inherent sensitivity creates what can be described as an emotional allergy. Just as a physical allergy is an intense, disproportionate immune response to a seemingly harmless substance like pollen or dust, an emotional allergy is a hypersensitive reaction to the psychological atmosphere. To a highly sensitive infant, a subtle shift in a parent's tone of voice, a tightening of the jaw, or a heavy unspoken sigh is not a minor event. It registers in their nervous system as a blaring siren, a massive disruption of their fragile equilibrium. They do not merely observe the anxiety, sadness, or exhaustion of their caregivers, they absorb it into their own physiology. The development of the brain is a surrealistic choreography. an intricate, continuous dance between the child's biological sensitivity and the emotional states of the adults raising them. Brain development is strictly use-dependent. The neural circuits that are frequently activated become heavily myelinated and permanent, while those that are neglected simply prune away. The regions of the brain responsible for maintaining attention, regulating emotional impulses, and feeling a sense of internal motivation, specifically within the prefrontal cortex, require a very specific environment to grow to their full potential. They require a consistent atmosphere of emotional safety, calm, and attuned interaction. The neurotransmitters that fuel these circuits, such as dopamine and serotonin, flourish only when the infant feels securely anchored in the present moment. Consider what happens when a highly sensitive infant is placed in an environment characterized by chronic, even hidden stress. The parents may be immensely loving, fiercely dedicated, and entirely well-intentioned. Yet, if those parents are burdened by financial panic, marital discord, their own unresolved childhood traumas, or the sheer frantic exhaustion of modern existence, their nervous systems will broadcast a frequency of anxiety. The sensitive infant, lacking the cognitive capacity to understand the source of this tension, feels only the overwhelming discomfort of the emotional static. They experience a profound distress, a disruption of their fundamental need for absolute emotional safety. When an infant experiences unendurable stress, they cannot rely on the standard biological defense mechanisms. They cannot fight the source of their distress, nor can they flee from the crib. Their physical helplessness leaves them with only one viable avenue of escape, a psychological retreat. The infant's brain initiates a profound defense mechanism. It dissociates. It simply pulls the plug on conscious awareness, tuning out the unbearable emotional reality of the present moment. The mind scatters itself to escape the pain of the immediate environment. If this tuning out occurs occasionally, it is merely a passing coping mechanism. However, if the environmental stress is chronic, and the infant is forced to repeatedly rely on dissociation to survive their emotional landscape, the brain is fundamentally altered. Because the brain develops in a use-dependent manner, this repetitive tuning out becomes physically hardwired into the neural architecture. The temporary vital defense mechanism solidifies into a permanent physiological default setting. The prefrontal cortex fails to fully integrate. The dopamine receptors do not develop their necessary density. By the time the child reaches school age, the inability to stay present is no longer a choice or a psychological defense. It is the physical reality of their neurology. The scattered mind is born not out of a defect in the child, but as a tragic, brilliant adaptation to an environment that their delicate nervous system found simply too much to bear. Chapter 3. The Crucial Imprint of Infancy, Attunement and Attachment. The survival of the human infant is a miracle of biological design, yet it depends entirely upon a vulnerability so profound it borders on absolute helplessness. Unlike the young of almost any other species, a newborn child cannot run from danger, cannot forage for sustenance, and cannot physically cling to a fleeing parent. To compensate for this total physical dependency, nature engineered a psychological mechanism of extraordinary power: attachment. Attachment is the invisible gravitational force that binds the child to the caregiver. It is a biological imperative, a fierce, driving instinct that prioritizes proximity to the protector above all other needs. For the infant, the attachment figure is not merely a provider of calories and warmth. They are the literal anchor to existence. If this bond is threatened, the infant's nervous system registers not a temporary inconvenience, but the terrifying, imminent threat of annihilation. Yet the raw drive for attachment is only the foundation. For the infant's brain to develop its highest capacities, the delicate circuits of emotional self-regulation, impulse control, and sustained attention, the sheer presence of a parent is insufficient. What is required is a deeper, infinitely more subtle connection known as attunement. If attachment is the strong, unbreakable rope that keeps the child from drifting out to sea, attunement is the electrical current of understanding that travels along that rope. It is the capacity of the parent to intuitively read the non-verbal language of the child, to resonate with their emotional state, and to respond in a way that makes the child feel seen, understood, and fundamentally safe. It is a process of deep physiological matching where two nervous systems calibrate to a shared frequency. It is vital to draw a sharp, uncompromising distinction between love and attunement. A parent can love a child with a ferocity that defies description, willing to sacrifice their very life for the infant's safety, yet still be entirely unattuned to that child in the present moment. Love is an emotion, a deeply held commitment. Attunement is a state of active, mindful presence. It requires the parent to temporarily lay aside their own psychological burdens, their anxieties about the future, and their unresolved pains from the past, in order to exist fully in the immediate reality of the child. When a parent is consumed by financial panic, grieving a loss, trapped in a hostile marriage, or simply ground down by the relentless pace of modern survival, their mind is elsewhere. The parent is physically there, but emotionally absent. To a sensitive infant, this emotional absence is not a subtle shift, it is a seismic event. An infant reads the environment exclusively through the nervous system of the primary caregiver. The caregiver's face, tone of voice, and muscular tension serve as the infant's mirror, reflecting the state of the world. When the parent is calm and attuned, the child's brain receives a steady stream of biochemical signals declaring that the universe is safe, allowing the energy of the body to be directed toward the monumental task of building new neural pathways. The right hemisphere of the mother's brain communicates directly with the right hemisphere of the infant's brain, regulating heart rate, respiration, and the delicate balance of dopamine and serotonin. However, when the parent's face goes blank with depression, or their energy becomes frantic with unspoken anxiety, the mirror shatters. The infant reaches out emotionally, seeking the stabilizing resonance of the caregiver, and grasps empty air. The infant's finely tuned radar detects the stress of the parent, and because the infant has no separate sense of self, they experience that stress as their own. The child feels a profound existential terror. The biological alarm systems are triggered, flooding the developing brain with cortisol and adrenaline. The child is thrust into a state of hyperarousal, desperate for the parent to return to emotional baseline so that the child too can find peace. Because the infant is entirely dependent, they cannot physically flee from a parent radiating distress, nor can they fight back against the overwhelming emotional atmosphere. Their only defense against unendurable emotional pain is psychological withdrawal. The brain, prioritizing immediate survival over long-term development, initiates a reflexive dissociation. The child simply tunes out. The mind detaches from the present moment, creating a protective barrier between the vulnerable self and the agonizing lack of connection. This tuning out is not a conscious rebellion or a behavioral flaw. It is a brilliant, desperate biological maneuver to preserve the infant's sanity in the face of intolerable emotional static. These early experiences of ruptured attunement leave indelible footprints within the nervous system. We tend to think of memory as a conscious filing cabinet of events, a birthday party, a harsh word, a vacation. This conscious narrative memory does not come online until later in childhood, but the body has an older, deeper system called implicit memory. Implicit memory does not record stories, it records emotional expectations and physiological responses. The repeated experience of reaching for emotional connection and finding an unbridgeable void becomes etched into the very architecture of the brain. The infant's nervous system learns that the present moment is an inherently painful and dangerous place to inhabit. Therefore, the brain wires itself accordingly. The circuits of attention, which require a foundation of absolute safety to engage with the external world, remain underdeveloped. The default state becomes one of chronic distraction, a permanent readiness to flee the moment. The profound tragedy of attention deficit disorder is that the scattered mind is the direct legacy of these unremembered ruptures. The adult who cannot focus on a conversation, who feels a ceaseless, gnawing restlessness, and who constantly escapes into daydreams or frantic activity, is unwittingly reenacting the survival strategy of a deeply sensitive infant. They are fleeing a present reality that, long ago, felt too terrifying and lonely to endure. The architecture of their brain was shaped by a surrealistic choreography of love entangled with absence, leaving a lifelong imprint of profound, unseen distress. Chapter 4. The Roots of ADD in Family Dynamics and Generational Trauma. The family is not merely a collection of individuals sharing a physical space. It is a complex, living, emotional ecosystem. When a child is born, they do not enter a blank slate. They arrive into a pre-existing psychological atmosphere, an intricate web of invisible emotional currents that have been flowing long before their first breath. To understand the genesis of a scattered mind, we must look beyond the isolated neurology of the child and examine the soil in which that mind was forced to take root. We must turn our gaze to the adults who provide the emotional weather of the home. It is within the unseen, unspoken dynamics of the family unit that the highly sensitive nervous system of the child is either nurtured into resilient focus or driven into the fragmented retreat of attention deficit. The parents serve as the infant's absolute buffer against the world. They are the shock absorbers for a nervous system that is not yet capable of regulating itself. When a car drives over a jagged, unpaved road, functioning shock absorbers take the brunt of the impact, ensuring the passengers inside experience a relatively smooth ride. But if those absorbers are worn thin, fractured, or completely broken down, the passengers feel every violent jolt, every jarring collision with the earth. In the architecture of the family, the emotional stability of the parents constitutes these vital shock absorbers. If the adults are grounded, attuned, and secure in their own psychological skins, they can absorb the inevitable stresses of life, financial pressures, career anxieties, the daily exhaustion of existence, without passing that frantic energy onto their offspring. However, when parents are burdened by their own unresolved pain, the family system loses its capacity to buffer stress. The adults may live together, share meals, and coordinate schedules, yet remain utter strangers to one another on a soul level. More tragically, they may remain strangers to themselves. Many adults walk through their days alienated from their own authentic emotions, having severed ties with their internal reality long ago in order to survive their own childhoods. A parent who is chronically disconnected from their own feelings cannot possibly attune to the delicate, shifting emotional landscape of a highly sensitive infant. You cannot offer an anchor to another human being if you are completely adrift yourself. In this state of profound, albeit hidden, emotional estrangement, the parental shock absorbers fail. The harsh vibrations of adult anxiety, depression, and marital friction are transmitted directly into the fragile neurology of the child. This transmission rarely happens overtly. The roots of attention deficit disorder are not necessarily found in households shattered by overt violence or blatant neglect. Often they grow in homes that appear perfectly functional, loving, and materially secure from the outside. The true source of the distress lies in the covert emotional reality of the family, the stories within stories. Every family possesses an explicit narrative, the conscious version of reality they present to the world and tell themselves. We are a happy family, we work hard, we love each other. But running silently beneath this surface narrative is an implicit story, written in the language of suppressed grief, unspoken resentments, and hidden fears. A sensitive child is essentially a biological Geiger counter for these covert emotions. They do not listen to the explicit narrative. They lack the cognitive development to even comprehend it. Instead, their nervous systems are entirely calibrated to read the implicit story. They detect the subtle rigidity in a mother's jaw, the hollow detachment in a father's eyes, the heavy, suffocating silence that fills the space between two parents who are trapped in a conflictual marriage but refuse to speak of it. The child absorbs these invisible toxins. They feel the immense weight of their parents' unwept tears and unexpressed rages. Because the child has no boundaries, they experience the adult's unconscious pain as their own overwhelming terror. This brings us to the profound reality of generational trauma. We do not merely inherit the physical traits of our ancestors, we inherit their unresolved psychological burdens. A father who grew up feeling profoundly inadequate will unconsciously project a rigid, desperate need for achievement into his home. A mother who was never made to feel safe in her own childhood will unconsciously broadcast a frequency of perpetual, low-grade panic, bracing for a disaster that never actually arrives. These adults are reenacting the unresolved scripts of their own pasts, entirely unaware that the emotional static of their history is deafening the present moment. The child, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of this inherited anxiety, has no choice but to deploy their ultimate biological defense. They scatter their attention, they tune out the present reality because the emotional atmosphere generated by the ghosts of their parents' pasts is too painful to inhabit. Understanding this generational chain is not an exercise in assigning blame. Blame is an intellectual dead end. It requires a villain and a victim, a willful perpetrator of harm. The parents who unwittingly create the emotional climate for attention deficit are not villains. They are fellow human beings struggling beneath the weight of their own unseen injuries. They are doing the absolute best they can with the psychological tools they were handed by the generations before them. To blame a parent for a child's scattered mind is as absurd as blaming a tree for growing sideways when the prevailing winds have battered it from birth. Yet releasing blame does not mean abandoning responsibility. A profound responsibility lies in waking up to these dynamics. Once we recognize that the child's distractibility, impulsivity, and emotional volatility are not random neurological errors, but direct reflections of the family's unseen emotional ecosystem, everything changes. The child ceases to be the problem and instead becomes the mirror. The symptoms of attention deficit act as a distress flare illuminating the hidden fault lines of the entire family structure. The child is carrying the emotional baggage that the parents were too overwhelmed to unpack. Therefore, the healing of the child cannot occur in isolation. It cannot be achieved merely by attempting to force the child to change their behavior, because the behavior is an adaptation to an environment that remains unbroken. True healing requires a courageous, unflinching examination of the stories within the stories. It asks the adults to embark on the terrifying journey of becoming known to themselves, to confront their own estrangements, and to heal the worn-out shock absorbers of their own psyches. When the parents begin to face their own hidden anxieties and untangle the generational knots of their own pasts, the emotional weather of the home begins to clear. The heavy, invisible static lifts. And slowly the sensitive child, no longer forced to unconsciously bear the emotional weight of their ancestors, can finally lower their defenses, return their mind to the present moment, and begin to heal. Chapter 5. The Frantic Culture and the Meaning of Distractibility. To fully comprehend the mind, we cannot merely peer into the isolated biology of the brain. We must examine the society in which that brain is forced to function. It is frequently observed that attention deficit disorder appears with far greater prevalence in North America than in other parts of the world. A popular, somewhat romantic theory suggests that this is a matter of genetics, that the New World was settled by restless, action-oriented risk-takers, and that today's scattered minds are simply the inheritors of these adventurous, nomadic genes. Another variation posits that the ADD brain is the descendant of prehistoric hunters, whose quick-witted, ever-scanning nature is now trapped in a modern society, built by the descendants of patient, stolid farmers. While these metaphors are poetic, they fall apart under historical scrutiny. The vast majority of immigrants were not thrill-seekers, but desperate laborers and refugees, fleeing famine or oppression. The true reason for the explosion of this condition in the industrialized West is much more prosaic and much more disturbing. It is the relentless erosion of the family unit under the crushing weight of modern social and economic pressures. Every creature on Earth possesses an environment of adaptedness, a specific set of conditions in which its biology and psychology are designed to thrive. Place the organism in a radically different environment and its behavior will become erratic, perhaps even detrimental to its own survival. The human brain is no exception. Over the past several decades, the pace of modern life has accelerated to a velocity that is fundamentally incompatible with the quiet, attuned nurturing required for healthy neurological development. The extended family has shattered, community support has evaporated, and the frantic, exhausted nuclear family is left to fend for itself. The sheer amount of free time available for a parent to simply be with a child has plummeted, replaced by the demands of commuting, dual incomes, and an unrelenting economic insecurity. We are attempting to raise the most sensitive and neurologically vulnerable infants the world has ever known within an emotional ecosystem that is perpetually stressed, distracted, and starved for time. Furthermore, our culture has evolved into one that actively mimics and reinforces the symptoms of attention deficit disorder. We live in a profoundly ADD-ogenic society. The hallmarks of our daily existence, the 10-second soundbite, the frantic camera cuts of a music video, the endless channel surfing, the obsession with instant gratification, and the total disregard for both past and future, are mirror reflections of the scattered mind. Consider the evolution of children's television. Decades ago, programs were designed with rapid-fire sketches and quickly shifting scenes specifically to accommodate the stressed, shortened attention spans of inner-city children living in deprived circumstances. Today, that hyperkinetic method of absorbing reality is simply taken for granted as the normal baseline for the entire population. The culture itself has become a powerful engine of distraction, demanding a shallow engagement with everything and a deep connection to nothing. How does the sensitive human brain cope with such an overwhelming, overstimulating, and emotionally precarious environment? It employs a brilliant, desperate survival strategy. It tunes out. What we call absent-mindedness is, in clinical terms, a state of dissociation. Dissociation is essentially a psychological anesthetic. In the physical world, pain is vital. It tells us to pull our hand away from a fire. But if a person is trapped in a blizzard with a broken leg and no help in sight, the brain may spontaneously block the excruciating pain so the victim can attempt to crawl to safety. Dissociation occurs when severe distress collides with absolute helplessness. For the highly sensitive infant whose environment is laced with chronic unspoken tension, the developing nervous system is flooded with unbearable emotional static. Unable to alter the environment or flee the crib, the child's mind simply pulls the plug on conscious awareness. This tuning out begins as a life-saving psychological defense, a way to separate the self from an agonizing reality. But there is a profound tragedy in relying on unconscious defenses. They are much like a man putting on a heavy, insulated fur coat to survive a freezing winter storm. The coat saves his life. Yet, if he is suddenly transported to the sweltering heat of the equator, that same coat becomes suffocating, unbearable, and highly detrimental to his well-being. If he could simply take the coat off, there would be no problem. However, because dissociation was initiated before the child even possessed a conscious will, it cannot be shed at will later in life. The defense mechanism takes on a life of its own. It wires itself into the physical architecture of the brain, becoming the default setting. The adult or child with ADD continues to tune out the world long after the original threat has passed, wandering through life with a mind that automatically severs its own thoughts to avoid the ghost of ancient pains. This deeply wired dissociation reveals the profound ignorance behind the constant demand that an ADD child simply pay attention. The very phrase implies a transactional debt, assuming that attention is a commodity the child possesses and is willfully withholding. But nobody is born with the capacity for sustained focus. Attention is an acquired skill, heavily dependent on the brain's delicate mechanisms of arousal. The ADD brain struggles with a chronic imbalance of arousal. It is frequently either completely under-aroused, leading to paralyzing lethargy, or intensely over-aroused by the brain's fear centers, resulting in a frantic gridlock of thought. The prefrontal cortex, which should smoothly allocate focus, is hijacked by the primitive emotional alarms of the amygdala. We tend to think of attention as an intellectual function, a matter of cold, hard logic. But from an evolutionary standpoint, attention is deeply rooted in the subsoil of emotion. The intellect cannot function without the motivating fuel of feeling. A child who appears endlessly distracted, staring out the window or acting the part of the erratic class clown, the quintessential flibbertigibbet, is not actually lacking focus. They are, in fact, fiercely focused on their own internal emotional reality, obsessively scanning the environment for a sense of safety, connection, and social survival. Their attention is drawn away from the chalkboard because their right brain emotional circuits are desperately trying to solve the agonizing problem of their own isolation. When we understand that tuning out is not a failure of willpower but a deeply ingrained reflex designed to protect a vulnerable heart, we realize that the path to focus is not paved with discipline and demands. It is paved with the one thing that naturally soothes the brain's alarm systems: genuine, unconditional emotional security. Chapter 6: Hyperactivity, Lethargy, and the Burden of Shame. The physical restlessness that so often defines attention deficit disorder in the public imagination is profoundly misunderstood. We observe a child in perpetual, exhausting motion, fidgeting, pacing, driven by an invisible motor, and we assume they are overflowing with an excess of energy that must be disciplined or drained. The reality of the scattered mind is precisely the opposite. This frantic physical activity is not a surplus of vitality. It is a desperate, unconscious attempt to compensate for a severe deficit of internal neurological arousal. When the delicate circuits of the prefrontal cortex lack the necessary neurochemical fuel to remain engaged with the present moment, the brain experiences a terrifying sense of falling asleep at the wheel. To ward off this encroaching void, the body takes over. The child moves, taps, and chatters relentlessly to generate the missing sparks of dopamine and adrenaline, effectively self-medicating an under-aroused brain through physical agitation. Yet this frantic pacing cannot be sustained indefinitely. The scattered mind exists in a state of violent oscillation, a heavy pendulum swinging between unsustainable extremes. When the hyperactive defense inevitably collapses, the pendulum swings backward into paralyzing lethargy. This is perhaps the most heavily judged and morally condemned aspect of the condition. We see a teenager staring blankly at a textbook, physically incapable of lifting a pencil to begin an assignment, and we label it laziness. We accuse them of lacking character or willpower, but this profound inertia is not a moral failing, it is a physiological shutdown. When a task holds no intrinsic emotional interest or immediate urgency, the brain's motivational apparatus simply refuses to ignite. The intellect may recognize that the homework is important, but without the emotional resonance required to activate the attention centers, the child is left stranded. They are like a driver furiously turning the key in the ignition of a car that possesses no spark plugs. The engine will not turn over, regardless of how desperately the driver wishes to move. Caught between the frantic drivenness of hyperactivity and the crushing weight of lethargy, the child inevitably falls short of the world's expectations. The surrounding environment, the school system, the family, the culture, demands a steady, consistent performance that the scattered neurology physically cannot produce. Consequently, the child's daily existence becomes a gauntlet of exasperated sighs, sharp corrections, and mounting frustrations from the adults they depend upon. Why can't you sit still? Why didn't you finish this? You're so smart, why don't you just apply yourself? Over time, this relentless barrage of criticism mutates into something far more toxic than temporary guilt. Guilt is the uncomfortable realization that one has committed a wrong action. It is a judgment upon behavior. But when a child's fundamental way of being in the world is constantly corrected, they do not internalize the belief that they made a mistake. They internalize the devastating conviction that they are a mistake. This is the genesis of shame. Shame is a totalizing, identity-destroying emotion. It is the deep, unspoken belief that one is inherently defective, unworthy of love, and fundamentally broken. For the child with a scattered mind, shame becomes the heavy, invisible cloak they wear every moment of their lives. It poisons their self-esteem and hardens their heart, driving them further into the defensive isolation of tuning out or pushing them toward the prickly, aggressive armor of defiance. How then do we break this tragic cycle? Because attention deficit is a developmental delay rather than a fixed, permanent disease, the capacity for healing remains intact. The brain retains its miraculous plasticity. The neurological growth that was stalled by early emotional static can resume provided the environment changes. The absolute foundation of this healing environment rests upon a single, uncompromising principle: unconditional positive regard. It is crucial to understand that unconditional positive regard is not merely a synonym for parental love. Most parents love their children with a fierce, unwavering dedication. But love, as it is felt internally by the parent, is often conditionally expressed to the child. Without realizing it, we make our warmth, our smiles, and our engaged presence contingent upon the child's compliance, their academic success, or their ability to regulate their behavior. We subtly withdraw our emotional resonance when they fail, believing that this coldness will serve as a necessary discipline. For the highly sensitive child grappling with an attention deficit, this conditional affection triggers the very survival anxieties that caused their minds to scatter in the first place. Unconditional positive regard demands that we strip away the transactional nature of our affection. It requires the parent to cultivate an atmosphere where the child knows, down to their very bones, that their worth is not tied to their performance. It is a profound, conscious decision to accept the child exactly as they are in the present moment, without the hidden agenda of fixing them. When a child is bathed in this kind of absolute non-judgmental acceptance, a profound physiological shift occurs. The brain's chronic alarm systems finally silence. The heavy burden of shame begins to lift. and the nervous system realizes it no longer needs to deploy the frantic defenses of hyperactivity or the numb retreat of lethargy. Only in this state of deep, unshakable emotional safety can the stalled circuits of the prefrontal cortex begin to grow again. To establish this safety, we must actively repair the ruptured connection. We must engage in the delicate, vital art of wooing the child. A child who has spent years accumulating shame and bracing for criticism will not automatically trust a sudden shift in parental attitude. Their hearts have hardened in self-defense. Wooing implies a gentle, persistent, and deeply respectful pursuit. It is akin to a courtship, where the objective is simply to win back the child's trust and delight in their existence. This wooing cannot be accomplished through grand gestures or expensive gifts. It happens in the quiet, unstructured moments of daily life. It means sitting on the floor to join them in a game without dictating the rules. It means listening to their chaotic, sprawling stories without correcting their grammar or rushing them to the point. It means offering a warm, spontaneous smile across a room for absolutely no reason other than the sheer joy that they exist. When we surrender our desperate need for the child to conform to our expectations, and instead focus entirely on wooing their heart, we provide the specific emotional nourishment their neurology has been starving for. We signal that the long, terrifying winter of their isolation is over, and the environment is finally safe enough for them to bloom. Chapter 7. Healing the ADD. Child, Oppositionality and Counterwill. It is essential to understand that sensitive children exist like fish in the sea. They are entirely immersed in the unseen emotional ecosystem of their environment. If the waters of a lake become polluted with invisible toxins, the fish inevitably begin to suffer, swimming erratically or losing their vitality. When faced with a sickly fish, a wise observer does not blame the creature for its failure to thrive. They immediately examine the quality of the water. Yet, when a highly sensitive child begins to exhibit the chaotic behaviors of attention deficit, impulsivity, chronic distractibility, or emotional volatility, society instinctively attempts to diagnose and fix the child in total isolation. This is a profound failure of perception. The child's fragmented attention is a direct manifestation of the emotional waters they inhabit. To initiate true healing, the adults in the child's life must first take absolute responsibility for purifying that environment. This requires an honest, often deeply uncomfortable examination of the hidden tensions, unspoken resentments, and unresolved anxieties that the child's nervous system has been quietly absorbing. When this toxic emotional static reaches a breaking point, children will inevitably act out, leading to a dynamic where adults frequently dismiss the behavior, claiming the child is just looking for attention. In the modern vocabulary of parenting and education, few phrases are wielded with such pejorative, dismissive weight. The tragic irony is that the accusation is entirely accurate, yet completely misunderstood. To accuse a distressed child of seeking attention is akin to accusing a starving person of seeking food. Attention, in its deepest, most authentic form of emotional attunement and secure attachment, is not a frivolous luxury. It is an absolute biological necessity for the developing brain. When a child behaves erratically to capture the focus of a parent or teacher, they are not engaging in a malicious, calculated manipulation. They are issuing a primal, desperate cry for connection. Their highly porous nervous system is signaling that it feels unanchored, terrified, and profoundly unsafe. Denying them this necessary attention as a form of moral discipline only deepens their neurological panic. Instead of viewing these frantic behaviors as infractions to be punished, we must recognize them as distress flares and respond by providing the very emotional anchor the child is starving for. If this primal cry for connection is repeatedly ignored or met with harsh correction, a new and profoundly challenging defense mechanism frequently emerges, creating a dynamic of the defiant ones, oppositionality. Many children struggling with attention deficit are simultaneously saddled with the heavy clinical label of oppositional defiant disorder. To the exhausted parent or frustrated teacher, this defiance appears as a calculated, willful rebellion against all forms of authority. The child automatically rejects the simplest requests, argues every minor point, and aggressively resists every direction. However, this oppositionality is rarely a conscious philosophical choice. It is a reflexive, instinctual armor deployed by a deeply wounded psyche. Compliance requires a foundation of absolute vulnerability. It requires the child to hold a deep, unconscious belief that the authority figure is a safe, protective presence. When that primary attachment bond is insecure, or when the child feels chronically criticized, yielding to the adult registers as a terrifying loss of self, they fight back, stubbornly digging in their heels, not because they desire endless conflict, but because their fragile autonomy feels constantly under siege. Therefore, the vital task for any caregiver is diffusing counterwill. This automatic resistance to coercion is rooted in a natural human instinct that flares up violently whenever we feel pushed, controlled, or forced against our own internal rhythm. In a healthy, securely attached relationship, counterwill is minimal. The child naturally wants to cooperate because the emotional bond is stronger than the desire for independence. But in the fragmented, heavily scrutinized world of the scattered mind, counterwill hardens into a permanent state of being. The more an adult pushes, dictates, and attempts to force compliance, the thicker the child's psychological armor becomes. This resistance cannot be broken through power struggles or punitive dominance, because every attempt to overpower the child only confirms their deep-seated fear that they are under attack. The adult, acting as a compassionate anchor rather than a tyrannical enforcer, must step completely off the battlefield. The solution lies in shifting the entire focus away from behavioral control and dedicating all energy toward relational repair. By offering choices instead of rigid ultimatums, validating the child's immense frustration and consistently prioritizing the warmth of the connection over the immediate completion of a task, the adult slowly disarms the instinctual reflex. When the child finally feels seen, understood, and emotionally safe, the iron grip of counterwill begins to soften, paving the way for the neurology to relax and true healing to begin. Chapter 8. Fostering Motivation. From the classroom to the teen years. A central mystery of the scattered mind is the apparent paradox of its motivation. To an outside observer, the child appears capable of immense, unshakable focus when engaged in an activity they find inherently fascinating, yet they seem entirely paralyzed when faced with a simple, mundane responsibility. This discrepancy frequently tempts parents and educators to rely on behavioral modification systems, sticker charts, bribes, or the heavy threat of punishment, in an attempt to force the child into action. However, these external motivators fundamentally misunderstand the neurology of autonomy. True motivation must ignite from within. When a child's internal drive is absent because the neural circuits of their prefrontal cortex are under-aroused, relying on external pressure is a futile exercise. The famous psychological experiments involving delayed gratification demonstrate that the ability to wait for a larger future reward relies on a sophisticated perception of time and a strong capacity for impulse control. For the highly sensitive, present-focused child, the immediate impulse violently overrides the future promise. The delayed reward is meaningless to a brain that only understands now. As one child humorously but tragically articulated, "My marshmallow caught fire." Their impulsive neurology burns down the prospect of a future reward in favor of an immediate, chaotic release from internal tension. Therefore, the objective of raising a child with these vulnerabilities cannot be to force compliance through endless external manipulation, a strategy that ultimately destroys the very autonomy we are attempting to cultivate. When we continually bribe or threaten a child, we rob them of the opportunity to discover their own internal compass. We must shift our approach from coercion to cultivation. This requires nurturing the child's internal sense of self-direction, allowing them to experience the natural consequences of their choices within a safe emotional container rather than imposing artificial punishments. It demands the profound patience to let the child discover their own intrinsic motivations without the constant, suffocating pressure of adult demands. We must recognize that true autonomy is not the ability to follow instructions flawlessly, but the capacity to act from a deeply rooted sense of one's own authentic will. This philosophical shift becomes extraordinarily difficult to maintain when the child steps into the traditional educational system. The modern school environment is practically engineered to expose and exacerbate the specific neurological vulnerabilities of the scattered mind. It demands prolonged static physical compliance, relentless focus on subjects that hold no intrinsic emotional interest, and a rigid adherence to arbitrary, unrelenting schedules. In this setting, the highly sensitive child inevitably flounders. They become the square peg violently hammered into the round hole. The adults surrounding the child, both parents and teachers, often descend into a state of chronic anxiety infected by the institutional belief that the child's entire future is evaporating before their eyes simply because they cannot sit still or complete a worksheet. The path forward through this educational labyrinth requires a profound shift in perspective, demanding the dual practice of trusting the child, trusting oneself. Parents must fiercely remember that a child's fundamental worth, intelligence, and ultimate potential are not determined by their ability to conform to a standardized curriculum. When parents trust their own deep intuition and maintain their role as the child's secure, unshakable emotional anchor, they can advocate effectively for their child without absorbing the school's institutional panic. They can act as a shield against the heavy expectations of the classroom. Teachers, too, must shift their focus from demanding blind obedience to fostering a relationship of genuine, mutual respect. They must recognize that a child who feels safe, valued, and understood in the classroom will naturally become more engaged. The educational focus must transition from obsessively correcting the child's deficits to nurturing their unique, often entirely overlooked, intellectual gifts. If the rigid demands of the classroom present a formidable challenge, the arrival of adolescence brings a profound relational earthquake. The teenage years are biologically designed for individuation, a necessary, often messy, pulling away from the parents to establish an independent identity. For the teenager grappling with an attention deficit, this period of development is fraught with unparalleled danger. Their inherent impulsivity, combined with the intense hormonal surges of adolescence and a lifelong accumulation of internalized shame, makes them exquisitely vulnerable to alienation, peer rejection, and the dark allure of high-risk behaviors. The central, exhausted complaint of the adolescent in this state is a desperate plea for relief. You are always on my case. They feel perpetually scrutinized, micromanaged, and judged for their disorganized bedrooms, their fluctuating grades, and their wildly erratic moods. They experience the parental gaze not as a warm light, but as a harsh, interrogating spotlight. If the parents respond to this necessary teenage rebellion by tightening their grip, demanding stricter rules, and increasing punitive measures in a desperate bid for control, they will absolutely sever the relationship. The critical, non-negotiable imperative during these turbulent years is to prioritize the attachment bond above all else. The parents must become a safe, silent harbor in a chaotic storm, rather than another storm the teenager must actively battle. This requires letting go of minor infractions, abandoning the desperate need to control their every decision, and actively listening to their profound, often turbulent emotional reality without immediately offering corrections or life lessons. The teenager does not need a manager, they need an ally. Only when the adolescent feels, down to their very bones, that the parent is an unshakable supporter rather than a relentless critic can they weather the chaotic transition into adulthood with their spirit and their self-esteem intact. Chapter 9. The ADD. Adult, self-esteem, relationships, and addiction. The transition into adulthood does not magically cure a scattered mind. It merely shifts the battlefield. For the adult carrying the unseen neurological wounds of attention deficit, the most profound struggle is rarely the inability to organize a desk or remember an appointment. The deepest, most agonizing wound lies in the invisible realm of self-esteem. True self-esteem is not a product of external validation. It is the quiet, unshakable conviction that one has a right to exist simply because one is alive. It is the internal resting place of the soul. For the ADD adult, this resting place was never fully constructed. Having spent a lifetime absorbing the implicit message that their natural way of being was flawed, frustrating, or simply too much for others to handle, they enter adulthood carrying a profound unconscious belief that they are fundamentally defective. Their entire life becomes an exhausting, relentless campaign of justifying one's existence. This desperate need for justification often manifests in two distinct yet equally tragic directions. Some adults collapse into chronic underachievement, paralyzed by the absolute certainty of failure. They withdraw from the arena of life, believing that if they do not try, they cannot be judged. Others become frantic overachievers, driven by a punishing internal motor that demands constant success, wealth, or societal approval to prove their worth. Yet, regardless of how many accolades they accumulate, the internal void remains unfilled. The praise simply slides off them, unable to penetrate the thick armor of their foundational shame. They live as impostors in their own lives, terrified that at any moment the world will finally discover the broken, incompetent child they still believe themselves to be. To understand why this shame is so deeply entrenched, we must examine the architecture of memory. When we think of memory, we usually envision explicit memory, the conscious recall of facts, faces, and personal narratives. But the brain possesses a far older, more powerful system known as implicit memory. Memories are made of this deeper substance, the physiological imprints of emotional experiences from our earliest days, before conscious thought even existed. The ADD brain is heavily burdened by the implicit memories of ruptured attunement, emotional absence, and the terrifying feeling of being left unanchored in the world. The adult does not consciously remember the infancy of these wounds, but their nervous system has never forgotten them. This implicit memory becomes the invisible saboteur in the realm of adult intimacy. When the ADD adult enters a romantic relationship, they do not arrive empty-handed. They bring the ghosts of their unhealed past into the present moment. This phenomenon results in the tragedy of remembering what didn't happen. A minor disagreement, a partner's momentary distraction, or a slight shift in tone does not register as a trivial present-day occurrence. Instead, it acts as a trigger, instantly pulling the adult back into the implicit memory of childhood abandonment. Their nervous system erupts with a disproportionate, violent intensity. They become enraged, profoundly depressed, or they completely tune out and withdraw. The partner is left bewildered, entirely unaware that they have just stepped on a psychological landmine buried decades before they ever met. The relationship becomes a theater where the ancient, unresolved dramas of childhood are endlessly reenacted. The ADD adult unconsciously demands that their partner provide the perfect, unwavering emotional attunement they were denied in infancy, an impossible task for any mortal human being. When the partner inevitably fails to maintain this perfect resonance, the old wounds tear open. The tragedy is that the adult is fiercely reacting to a current situation through the distorted lens of implicit memory, completely unable to see the actual partner standing in front of them. The intimacy they so desperately crave is continuously destroyed by the very defense mechanisms they developed to survive their original lack of connection. Faced with this relentless internal pain, the chronic low self-esteem and the chaos of unstable relationships, the scattered mind frantically seeks relief. It is within this desperate search for soothing that we find the profound, intimate connection between the ADD brain and addictions. Addiction is not a moral failure or a simple lack of willpower. It is a desperate, misguided attempt at self-medication. Whether the addiction is to a substance like alcohol or narcotics, or to a process like compulsive working, gambling, or shopping, the underlying physiological drive is identical. The addict is attempting to artificially alter the neurochemistry of a brain that is chronically under-aroused and drowning in emotional pain. The substances and behaviors of addiction temporarily flood the brain with dopamine and endorphins, providing a fleeting, artificial sense of the peace, focus, and emotional warmth that the individual's natural neurochemistry cannot sustain. For a brief, intoxicating moment, the agonizing static clears. The heavy burden of having to justify one's existence evaporates. But this relief is a devastating illusion. It is a chemical anesthetic that numbs the pain without ever treating the wound. In place of tears and sorrow, the addict chooses the numbing comfort of their compulsion. True healing from the wounds of the past requires a courageous, unflinching confrontation with that original pain. It requires grieving for the attuned childhood one never received. Addiction violently halts this necessary grieving process. It freezes the individual in a state of arrested emotional development, ensuring that the implicit memories remain forever trapped within the body, and the scattered mind remains perpetually lost in the wilderness. Chapter 10. Self-Parenting, Medication, and the True Meaning of Attention. The ultimate challenge for the adult struggling with a scattered mind is the profound realization that no one is coming to rescue them. The childhood environment, with all its hidden tensions and ruptured attunements, is firmly in the past. The parents who unwittingly contributed to the neurological delay cannot travel back in time to provide the perfect, unwavering anchor that was needed. The adult must therefore step into the terrifying, liberating role of becoming their own caretaker. There is a powerful mythological resonance in the story of Moses, an abandoned infant set adrift in a fragile basket on the chaotic waters of the Nile, ultimately saved by the protective gaze of an angel. In the journey of adult healing from attention deficit, the individual must play both parts. They are the vulnerable, drifting child, and they must become the powerful, intervening angel. This conscious practice of absolute self-care and internal nurturing is the physical and spiritual foundation of self-parenting. Compassionate curiosity in the search for self-insight. The first and most critical act of self-parenting is fundamentally altering the internal dialogue. For decades, the scattered mind has been governed by a ruthless, tyrannical internal judge, constantly criticizing every forgotten detail, every impulsive outburst, and every failed endeavor. To heal, this judge must be permanently dethroned. In its place, the adult must cultivate a profound, unwavering practice of compassionate curiosity in the search for self-insight. This is not an invitation to passive self-pity or an excuse for destructive behavior. Rather, it is the disciplined practice of witnessing one's own mind without moral condemnation. When the adult finds themselves paralyzed by procrastination or engulfed in an irrational rage triggered by a minor event, the compassionate observer does not attack. Instead, it asks, "What is happening inside my nervous system right now? What old, unhealed wound has this present moment touched?" This shift from self-flagellation to self-inquiry is revolutionary. It requires the individual to treat their own psychological pain with the same profound respect and gentleness they would offer to an injured animal. Through this compassionate curiosity, the adult begins to recognize the invisible triggers of their implicit memory. They learn to separate the reality of the present from the terrifying emotional echoes of the past. As they consistently offer themselves the unconditional positive regard they were denied in childhood, the chronic alarm systems of the brain slowly begin to silence. The heavy, suffocating armor of shame starts to crack, allowing the neurological circuits of self-regulation the safety they require to finally resume their growth. This internal restructuring must be supported by an intentional transformation of the external world. The physical and spiritual environment the adult inhabits plays a crucial role in self-parenting. A brain that is easily overwhelmed by sensory input and emotional static cannot heal in an atmosphere of perpetual chaos. The adult must fiercely protect their own peace. This means creating physical spaces of simplicity and order, minimizing exposure to the frantic, overstimulating noise of the surrounding culture, and intentionally seeking out the grounding silence of nature. It also involves the difficult, necessary work of establishing rigid boundaries in interpersonal relationships, refusing to participate in toxic dynamics that recreate the anxieties of childhood. The individual must consciously engineer an environment that whispers safety to their nervous system. Sleep hygiene. Within this cultivation of the physical environment, perhaps the most stubbornly ignored necessity is the biological imperative of rest. The ADD adult is locked in a lifelong agonizing battle against the night. Because their waking hours are characterized by chronic under-arousal and a frantic search for stimulation, the transition to sleep feels akin to a terrifying surrender to the void. The brain resists shutting down, preferring the exhausting hum of anxiety to the quiet emptiness of the dark. Consequently, the individual develops atrocious habits, relying on screens, late-night projects, or physical exhaustion to simply collapse into unconsciousness. Establishing rigorous sleep hygiene is therefore not a matter of luxury. It is a fundamental neurological intervention. Sleep is the precise physiological arena where the brain consolidates memory, repairs its weary circuits, and replenishes the depleted stores of dopamine and serotonin required for focus. When the adult commits to a sacred, unalterable routine of preparing the body and mind for rest, they are directly medicating the underlying exhaustion that drives their scatteredness. The concept of medication, however, is a profoundly complex and emotionally charged territory. When an individual with severe attention deficit first tries a psychostimulant, the experience can be nothing short of a revelation. One adult described looking out the window after taking their first dose and weeping because for the entire duration of their life they had merely seen a blur of green. Now, suddenly, they saw the individual, majestic architecture of the trees. The medication acts as a chemical jumper cable, shocking the dormant, under-aroused prefrontal cortex into wakefulness. It rouses the sleeping policeman of the brain, suddenly granting the individual the capacity to pause between impulse and action, to hold a single thought in the mind without it evaporating, and to experience the profound quiet relief of a silenced internal chaos. Yet it is a tragic mistake to equate this chemical intervention with a cure. Medications are powerful tools, but they cannot perform the fundamental work of healing. A pill can temporarily suppress the hyperactivity of the brain, but it cannot impart the psychological skills necessary to navigate a complex emotional life. It cannot teach an adult how to read the subtle nuances of human intimacy. It cannot reconstruct a shattered self-esteem, and it certainly cannot rewrite the agonizing implicit memories of early childhood abandonment. Furthermore, medications come with limitations. Their effects wear off as the sun goes down, returning the individual to their scattered baseline, and they do not work universally or indefinitely. To rely solely on pharmacology is to mistake the crutch for the healed bone. The true utility of medication is simply to create a temporary clearing in the dense fog of the mind, a brief window of neurological stability during which the difficult, agonizing, and magnificent work of self-parenting and emotional maturation can finally take place. Ultimately, the journey of healing from attention deficit disorder transcends the mere acquisition of organizational skills or the ability to quietly sit through a meeting. It culminates in a radical redefinition of what it means to attend. In our frantic, hyper-capitalist culture, attention is typically viewed as a mechanical tool for productivity, a beam of light to be pointed at a task until the task is completed. But in its deepest, most profound sense, attention is a spiritual capacity. To truly attend to something is to offer it your absolute, undivided presence. When the scattered mind heals, it does not become a rigid, unfeeling machine of efficiency. It retains its brilliant sensitivity, its sweeping creativity, and its deep, resonant empathy. But it is no longer forced to flee the present moment in terror. True attention is the opposite of dissociation. It is the courageous act of choosing to inhabit reality exactly as it is, without the protective armor of tuning out. It is the ability to look deeply into the eyes of a loved one and hold their gaze without the ghost of past trauma pulling you away. It is the capacity to sit in silence and feel the agonizing, beautiful weight of one's own existence without frantically reaching for a distraction. In the end, to attend is to love. And for the individual who has spent a lifetime trapped in the chaotic exile of a scattered mind, the ability to finally offer that loving, grounded attention, both to the world and to themselves, is the ultimate triumph of the human spirit.